Welcome to all our listeners. Welcome to the Tax Relief, Taxi Violence and Devastating Conflict in Africa episode of Ubuntunomics. This week we'll be looking at the SARS emergency tax relief, mediation of the Cape Town taxi violence, the Gazetted local elections date and South Africa's vaccine progress, as well as the Mercenaries in Libya, slow regional industrialization in SADC, the ECOWAS Youth for Peace, and the devastation in Tigray. With me is Sbu Nyati from Isakombe Assets. Hello Sbu, how are you doing this week?
No, I'm fine, thank you, Sia. How are you this week?
I'm all right, thank you very much. And I'm joining you from Abidjan this week. And in an interesting turn of events, my flight has left me behind, but that's a conversation for another day. And I think let's get started with the episode for this week. On that note, I'll get started with the SA update for this week. Our first story on the SA update is SARS to implement tax relief. The South African Revenue Service, SARS, will implement tax relief measures in response to the continuing COVID-19 pandemic and the recent unrest. The SARS Commissioner, Edward Kieswetter, said that the collections in the first quarter of 2021 have exceeded expectations and outperformed revenue collection for the same period over the past 3 years. And as a result, the SARS is supporting the economy through tax relief measures, including a tax subsidy of up to 750 Rand per month for the next 4 months for private sector employers who have employees earning below 6,500 Rand under the Employment Tax Incentive, the ETI. And those businesses that are tax compliant and earning gross income of up to 100 million Rand will be allowed to delay 35% of their pay-as-you-earn liabilities over the next 3 months without any penalties or any interest to be accrued. And this will apply for a period of 4 months, which will come in effect on 1 August 2021 and ending on the 30th of November 2021. Sbu, you've got some interesting questions around this one. What were some of the thoughts that were rummaging through your mind as you heard of this news?
Yeah, when I heard of this, I thought about how in South Africa we rate the performance of a SARS commissioner according to the amount of extra revenue they are able to bring in. I wonder about how true a reflection this is. We shall remember that the current Minister of Public Enterprises, Mr. Pravin Gordhan, who is also a former SARS commissioner himself, how he played down the performance of Mr. Tom Moyane, the the last SARS commissioner. He pointed out the fact that if there is growth in the economy, however slight, tax revenues will always grow. And Mr. Moyane's claim to fame was that he was the first to go above 1 trillion Rand in revenue collections. So my question is, so how much of this exceeded expectation? Because they expected so much and Mr. Kieswetter has exceeded that. How much was that due to his own efforts, his own input? Because we will remember, was it not just a coincidence? Because we've had a commodity price surge, and the financial sector also paid more. In fact, what I'm trying to say, the financial sector also performed much better than during the lockdown period. So how much of an effect was this?
You raise an interesting question, and I think the short answer is that it's not clear at this point. Obviously, the insinuation with we've collected more than we expected is that Mr. Kieswetter is effectively changing or improving the revenue collection or the tightness of the revenue services operation. But it's not all simply because of his own doing. I think also the economy, in comparison to where we thought we would have performed in 2020, has actually performed a lot better in terms of real GDP growth than what was expected. Although they've not clarified what portion of the increased revenue collection comes from the better economic performance, it's clearly not all about Mr. Kisveter's own performance. So you're right, it is a mixture of better than expected economic conditions, as well as some of the revenue services collections in itself. Of course, under lockdown or more restricted movement of people, more restricted business activity generally, it would be a lot easier for SARS to actually improve in its collections. So I would say it's a mixture of these impacts in terms of what is really the cause for the better than expected revenue collections.
Yeah, my other point is about the expanded employment tax incentive, which is welcome. And we hope it will yield the desired results. Now, how do we really gauge the strength of our tax policy? I do acknowledge, that the often talked about distributive attributes of our tax collection system, our how we distribute from the rich to the poor, and all that. Yet, at face value, it does not really look like the tax regime supports the necessary growth that is needed in those sectors that lead to mass employment creation. For example, sectors or industries like manufacturing, heavy or light industries, or even mining, which have the capability of creating jobs for huge numbers. I mean, in a country like South Africa, with well-documented record levels of inequality, you need an optimal tax policy, one that incentivizes and directs investment. So an enterprising nation does not solely rely on foreign direct investment. Taxes can be used as a tool to drive local demand, which will stimulate growth. For example, why do we have such high fuel levies in South Africa in an economy which is about 60% driven by consumption, which in an economy which imports almost all of its liquid fuels? So maybe it is a matter of our industrial policy not talking to our tax policies or tax regime. What are your thoughts about my rant?
I think you raise very interesting questions, and I must admit it's quite broad, but for me, there are three things that jump up straight into my mind. So the first thing is what you mentioned about tax policy that not only is about balancing the budget and is actually about directing capital or directing investment through incentives to where we need it in the economy. Your first point was about the employment tax incentive. I feel where we've set it is too low. I mean, if you're talking about incomes below 6,500 Rand a month, this is just too low for anybody to actually survive. Given the high costs and the increased costs of energy and electricity and fuel, as well as food costs, that income level, and if we're trying to spur employment, we shouldn't be focusing on employment at the lowest rung of less than 6,500 Rand a month. So that's my first point, in that already we're not actually setting the right type of incentives, nor are we setting the right signals for employers in the market. The second point is the response of SARS as well as our industrial policy has been very slow. One of the more commendable recent moves that SARS has implemented is an export duty on scrap metals. And while I was at National Treasury, I was actually dealing with the scrap metals request from industry as an economist in the secondary sector. This was in 2014, at a time when our scrap metals were suffering greatly due to imports from, our scrap metals locally were suffering greatly due to exports to India and China, who were obviously using our scrap metals to produce products, final products. As a result, our local manufacturing, our steel and engineering sector suffered because what used to be a very cheap steel industry and a steel location in South Africa ended up becoming overly priced. And obviously this has got to do partly with the exports which were going to India and China, but also due to the import parity pricing model of large steel producers such as ArcelorMittal. And the government's response was very slow in this, and this is largely due to the poor coordination, not only between ourselves, National Treasury, and the SARS, which should be much better given the fact that SARS is part of the Ministry of Finance family of institution. However, what was worse was our coordination with Department of Trade and Industry. As a result, the export tax was only implemented much later. In fact, after I'd even left the economic policy desk at the National Treasury. I think it was around 2015 or 2016 when we finally saw this. Currently, they've extended the tax, the export tax on scrap metals to become an ad valorem tax. Initially, it was a sort of excise tax to say those firms that are exporting scrap metals will be taxed a certain amount. Now it has to do with the amount that you're actually exporting, and it is a per unit type of tax being, ad valorem. So for me, it's a shocker that it's taken, when I was at National Treasury in 2014, about 7 years ago, it's taken 7 years to get to where we are. And at this point, the markets have moved, the industry has suffered, we've lost a lot of jobs in the steel and engineering sector. And you might remember that in 2014, when the industry was hurting, they had to institute lockouts where certain employers had to lock out employees from their offices because of fears of damage to property, etc., because the workers were striking due to the wage negotiations that had turned pear-shaped. And it is of little impact now that we've come to the final kind of policy that we needed about 7 or 8 years ago. So that's the other point I want to make, that you're right. It is a poor coordination amongst the players that are very important in instituting an industrial policy to redirect capital. Then my last point is that obviously SARS is not very effective in its own role. If you look at what we see as illicit financial flows, which of course happen not just financially but also through our exports in terms of base erosion and profit shifting. So it is all these issues through slow and poor capacity at SARS in order to ensure that they're closing the gap and ensure that they find ways to deal with the problem of illicit financial flows. It's so severe that the private sector, where you've got consulting firms that are actually employing former SARS staff members in order to run their own base erosion and profit shifting departments and their own illicit financial, so consulting for firms on how they can actually implement successful illicit financial flow strategies. So, for me, it highlights these three areas where our policies, and at least our tax policy, really needs room for improvement in terms of being set at the equitable level in order to provide the right incentives and create decent jobs and decent incomes. Secondly, poor coordination, which needs to improve amongst the government departments, and largely the capacity issue within SARS itself, particularly at the customs level, which is very important in order to implement an effective tax and industrial policy strategy. So for me, that is really where the areas of improvement are, and what I've noticed as our clear shortcomings in this regard. Moving on to the next story this week from the SA Update. Parties agree to mediation in Cape Town taxi violence. Parties involved in the conflict by the taxi industry in Cape Town have agreed to arbitration after the initial mediation process had collapsed. The root cause of the conflict in the Western Cape stems from the disagreement between the Cape Amalgamated Taxi Association, CATA, and Cape Organization for the Democratic Taxi Associations, CODETA. The government has engaged both Kata and Kodeta, as well as the provincial leaders of the South African National Taxi Association, Santaco, to find a long-term solution, but still this has evaded government as well as the taxi associations.
It is about our apartheid spatial planning that has not been rejigged. I mean, South Africa needs a proper mass transportation system so that the country and its economy stops being beholden to these taxi mafia bosses. I understand that once fixed investments in an economy or in infrastructure have been made, it becomes very expensive to fix, to play around with your transport system, your infrastructure, and all of that. This is why I'm against the Islamization of urban areas in Africa. But anyways, the workforce, our South African workforce, still needs to be transported because they live tens of kilometers away from industrial and commercial centers. So years of public disinvestment have also hollowed out the system itself, and SOEs in the past decade have also not performed their functions properly. So you will know that Sanral and Prasa are just dysfunctional. So basically, there is no mass rail passenger service in the country. So there was also a bus transit system which was introduced mainly in the urban centers, which was supposed to lessen the heavy burden, but that seems to also have been, it was the way they structured it. It services the more affluent areas, not the working class who live in these outlying townships. So basically, the government has failed dismally, in my opinion, to professionalize and discipline this taxi industry. Even this peace deal that you are talking about, which was signed recently, was broken the next day because another taxi driver was gunned down.
Yeah.
So I want what's your opinion? How do we professionalize this informal taxi industry? Because a lot of these ministers which we've had have almost all of them failed. I mean, we've had a number of them over the years.
It's actually interesting that the current Minister of Transport, Mr. Fikile Mbalula, has promised that he will professionalize and discipline the taxi industry. But so far, he's completely failed. For me, I think there are two things to mention. So firstly, you cannot talk public transport without linking the various modes. And this speaks to how our taxi industry needs to be integrated into how we deal with the various modes. Currently, the taxi industry accounts for about 60% in terms of commuters, and yet it's the one mode that is unregulated, that is also not subsidized, that is actually poorly managed in terms of its relation with government, but the management of the industry as itself as well. And for me, that speaks to the fact that the taxi industry is not integrated. And if we're going to provide subsidies to buses, for example, and rail and others, we need to find a way that we can, trade off providing subsidies to the industry as well as formalizing and professionalizing it. In the beginning of the pandemic, when all the various sectors were looking for government support as a result of the lockdown, I had thought that the government was treading in the right direction by making such recommendations in terms of its bargaining with the taxi industry, in terms of saying, we'll provide support to you, but you need to formalize the way in which you operate. And that could have been done in various ways, whether that's by permits or in formalization of the management of assets in terms of the taxes themselves in order to ensure roadworthiness, etc. But none of that is actually materialized. One case study, though, that is interesting, and I think is something that we can, learn from, is the Rea Vaya system. As a result, obviously, it's not perfect. It's had its own shortcomings, but it's to me the most successful way of integrating, the taxi industry into the mainstream, public transport system. What happened was over 400 taxi owners were converted into so-called shareholders and operators of the Rea Vaya bus transit system. So where there were routes and parts of the network that were now being rendered economically unviable or that couldn't compete with the bus rapid transit system, those taxi drivers were then integrated as shareholders and also drivers of the bus rapid transit system in Gauteng. Unfortunately, that has not been able to be replicated elsewhere, as we've seen with the complete failure in Nelson Mandela Bay, which has resulted in that bus rapid transit system being abandoned. And so for me, it's all about integration and finding a way. It's almost as though you're dealing with former freedom fighters and integrating them in the new sort of defense force post-liberation. That's the way I view a solution in terms of how we can professionalize the taxi industry. Then my last point has got to do with the structural issues which you mentioned, which is the spatial legacy of apartheid. I've done a paper on, the taxi industry some years back, and during my research found that, generally we all understand there's so-called rush hours in South Africa. And typically we're talking 4 hours here. This is 6 to 8 a.m. in the morning and 4 to 6 p.m. in the evening. And this is largely because people are traveling between where they work and where they live. And as a result of the spatial legacy of apartheid, people still live very far from where they work. As a result, the taxi industry on a daily basis between these rush hour periods, so from 8 a.m. up until 4 p.m., is actually dormant. Most taxis are either sitting at some mall waiting for people to knock off and catch taxis home, or they're running around half empty looking for passengers. And that is a uniquely South African problem which results from the spatial legacy of apartheid. As I can speak to you now, when I left my hotel this morning, there was actually quite a lot of traffic, and I would have thought that this is after rush hours, and I'm talking about 11 or 10 a.m. in the morning. But it was almost as though I was traveling at 6 a.m. or 6 to 8 a.m. in South Africa, given the amount of traffic that was on the road. And this speaks to, this country not having that spatial past that we have in South Africa. And as a result, transport and movement of people continuously happens throughout the day. And I think that also is a critical part in resolving the challenge of public transport in South Africa. Moving on to the next story. Our next story is the local elections date being gazetted. The Minister of Cooperative Governance and Traditional Affairs, Dr. Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma, has gazetted the date of 27 October for the scheduled local government elections. The Constitution and Municipal Structures Act prescribes that local elections should be held within a period of 90 days at the end of the 5-year term. And the Independent Electoral Commission has lodged an application at the Constitutional Court to defer the scheduled elections to no later than February 22, in line with the Musaneke inquiry. You had a point to make about this. What was that point, Sbu?
Well, this is just a formality. That's my point. Even though a group like AfriForum is joining those who are taking the IEC to court as an interested party. By the way, I don't. My point is, I don't see the Constitutional Court going against the advice of medical experts, which is what informed the IEC decision itself.
I definitely agree. And I think also the Musaneke inquiry was quite all-encompassing in that very thorough, received over 4,000 submissions, had made, verbal, written, and, various modes of submission as well. So, yeah, I think I agree with you. This is largely a procedural matter. So I do think that we will see the elections being postponed. Moving on to our last story from South Africa this week. SA vaccinations gain momentum. South Africa has now administered a total of 8 million COVID-19 vaccinations, pushing the number of fully vaccinated adults to 3.2 million. And at this rate, the country is vaccinating on average 220,000 people per day against the president's target of 300,000. So South Africa has received an additional 2.8 million Pfizer vaccines from the United States as part of a donation that the United States has made to boost the country and the rest of Africa's COVID vaccine access. This initiative is part of a collaboration between the Africa Vaccine Acquisition Trust, AVAT, COVAX, and well as the United States government, with the African Union member states set to receive about 25 million COVID-19 vaccine doses to enhance coverage across the continent. Currently, the plan is to vaccinate at least 60% of the African population by the end of this year. You had some questions about this one.
Yeah, I had a concern. My concern is the rate of vaccine supplies coming in, and that even the Aspen facility out in Gqeberha, which has been subcontracted by Johnson & Johnson to package doses, is mainly set up for the export market. The other thing we might have to worry about is the willingness to be vaccinated by the general population. There have been calls made by the government to men above the age of 60 years to present themselves at vaccination sites. People are just not going. Do you think now that the 60% vaccination rate that you're talking about for the African population will be achieved, say, in the next 3 years, let's say, since the continent has only done about 2%, only vaccinated about 2% thus far?
Yeah, that's very worrying. My simple answer is no. I just don't see it. Look, the current numbers, I mean, yes, they look impressive, 25 million additional doses, but the fact is we have a population of around 1.2 billion people. And 60% of that, you're looking at around 800,000 people, 800 million people. So that is definitely a pale in comparison compared to where the vaccine target needs to reach in order to reach the 60%. That is a very, very ambitious target, and I highly doubt that it will be achieved in such a short time.
Yeah, and people have to be willing to be vaccinated. That's another point.
Yeah, so at about 1.2 billion, you're talking what, 720,000 people that need to be vaccinated. I don't think that that's going to happen given 720 million, with the 25 million doses that we've just received from the United States. So, yeah, on that note, that brings an end to our SA update this week. That brings us to the Africa Regional Update for this week. Our first story in the Africa Regional Update, Mercenaries impede peace in Libya. The continued recruitment and presence of mercenaries in Libya is impeding the peace process and is becoming an obstacle to the upcoming elections. The highly armed and well-trained private contractors from Russia, Syria, Sudan, and Chad pose dangers within Libya and could threaten regional security and stability. In the Libyan Political Dialogue Forum, the LPDF, which took place in Tunisia during November 2020, participants agreed on a roadmap to national elections which are planned for the 24th of December 2021. The next major step of implementing the ceasefire agreement is the withdrawal of mercenaries, foreign fighters and forces from Libya in order to ensure safe and secure environment for the elections to take place.
We must talk about the inability of African governments to defend their sovereign borders. We have seen Russian firms deployed alongside government troops in places like the CAR, and little in the way of condemnation from the AU maybe or other bodies. Then there are all the battle-hardened ex-ISIL combatants that you were talking about from war-ravaged Syria who have found new frontiers on the African continent. That's scary to me. You can sign all the peace agreements as warring parties, but without foreign forces first agreeing to move out, that peace deal is as good as null. It usually just gets derailed. In this case, all sides, both sides, in this Libyan conflict, have their own foreign fighters. I know for a fact that there is the silencing of the guns initiative by the AU, but now one wonders about its effectiveness. You will have to forgive me on this one for asking this question. I mean, what is the current status on the AU front? The plans to deal with the influx of foreign armed men?
Yeah, I just don't see their abilities, bro. That's my long and short of it. Apart from, publishing press statements or holding dialogues and, encouraging both parties to come to the table for negotiations and, ending the violence, there's nothing more that the AU has actually been able to do. Forget about a military intervention, forget about anything else. The most that they probably would be able to do is to suspend the membership of Libya if the elections don't take place, or if, the agreements around the Libyan People's Dialogue does not yield, sustainable peace. But beyond that, there's very little that I think the AU is able to do. And again, it is, high time that these private military mercenaries leave Libya. I just don't see how they'll be forced or how they'll be encouraged to do so, given the fact that they're taking advantage of the instability for their own private gains, and have actually become a major source of threats in the Sahel itself. One of the recent findings in research I came across on the Chad situation was that, the rebels and the Muslim extremists have always been present within the Sahel region. But what has differed since the death of Muammar Gaddafi and the fall of Libya is the fact that they've become more armed, they've become more violent, and actually posed a much more severe security threat. And, unfortunately, these are also countries with highly ineffective national defense forces, which have relied, squarely on the support of either France or the US in terms of their engagement and curbing the threat of terrorism. And we're seeing it spread into not only North African region, but the Sahel particularly, all the way from the Middle East in terms of the terrorist threat and the spread of ISIL. There's just nothing that the AU has done or can do about this at this point. That takes us to our next story from the Africa Regional Update: slow regional industrialization in SADC. The Southern African Development Community SADC Ministerial Task Force on Regional Integration and the Committee of Ministers of Trade held virtual meetings to deliberate on a number of issues regarding regional integration, including the implementation of the SADC Industrialization Strategy and Roadmap 2015 to 2063. The SADC Protocol on Industry was approved by the 39th SADC Summit in August 2019 in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. And as of July 2021, the protocol has been signed by 13 heads of state and government and ratified only by the Seychelles. The Democratic Republic of Congo, South Africa, and Zambia are the three member states who are yet to sign the protocol. And this meeting also noted that the 6 member states, Angola, Eswatini, Namibia, Mauritius, South Africa, and Zimbabwe, have ratified the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement without having ratified the SADC Protocol on Industry. You had a few points about this. What were those points, Boo?
Is it? I mean, that point, that bit about this protocol being ratified only by the Seychelles. I mean, that's where the problem lies, isn't it? And things. I mean, you mentioned that South Africa, Zambia have also not signed the protocol. I don't know. This is. I mean, there doesn't appear to be the necessary political will from the regional bloc to integrate. one is left thinking that these countries have no qualms maintaining the current status quo. I mean, I hear all this talk about overcoming divisions that impede the flow of goods, services, and capital and people, and all the overcoming divisions that constrain growth. I mean, to me, that's all just plain talk. It's there are no actions here. When one looks at this, uh, this was supposed to be a 2015 to 2063 plan, meaning it's already 6 years late. Now, my question is it cheap Chinese and East Asian consumer goods imports and maybe the reliance on a fairly industrialized South Africa for equipment and capital goods supplies that has resulted in this laxity, or is it just all plain old ineptitude from our leaders?
Sure, I think that's a good question. The way I'm understanding and the way I'm reading the situation, obviously, is that historically, the process of regional integration in Africa has been driven by a key, charismatic figures, whether that be Muammar Gaddafi, Obasanjo, and even Thabo Mbeki. And what we've seen with the recent restructuring of the African Union and the chairpersonship of President Paul Kagame was a shift away from it being driven by these charismatic leaders and the notions of Pan-Africanism to it being much more grounded in economics. And the idea has been that we need to actually trade more with one another. And that needs to be the foundation of our regional integration, not these high-level ideas of Pan-Africanism and our ideals on, a unified Africa. Although those are good, what keeps countries and regions integrated is the continued economic relations and engagements. And what we've seen, at least in the SADC region, is obviously these leaders have left power, the charismatic leaders, and although the SADC region is amongst the most integrated, in comparison to other African regions, if you compare it to ECOWAS, if you compare it to even the Central or even West African CFA regions, SADC is actually the one that is charting ahead in terms of regional integration and intra-regional trade. And what we've seen in the SADC region has been that the economic challenge or crisis that's affecting South Africa in terms of slow growth, as well as the recent pandemic, has actually reversed a lot of those gains. And obviously, without the charismatic leaders, and even Zimbabwe's Mugabe, who have been the glue that has driven SADC regional integration, there seems to have not been this the fervor or political will, as you've mentioned. And despite it now being driven more by economics, countries are obviously balancing their own domestic economic challenges with the imperatives of the region, and it reflects, despite so many heads of state signing on to the protocol on industry, only one country has ratified it. And being a small island state, the Seychelles is quite reliant on imports from the region, and it is definitely in their interest to see a much more integrated, better trading region in SADC. And it's reflected in how the countries have either not ratified or not responded. What's also interesting is that despite not signing on to the SADC process, they seemingly have taken on more interest, at least within the Africa Continental Agreement, at least with some of the countries which are either major regional centers apart from South Africa, in case of Angola and Zimbabwe and Mauritius, but also the smaller states that are linked to South Africa in Eswatini, Namibia. So it's not clear to me that the SADC region is moving in one direction as a whole. They seem to be pulled apart by national context within their countries, but also this lack of a charismatic leader in order to drive the political will has reversed some of those gains. So that's the way I'm seeing things. And obviously, the economic challenges and the current crises we're in terms of the pandemic has also had a negative impact on the progress that SADC has been able to make. So that takes us to our next story, an ECOWAS Youth Workshop for Peace. The Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS Commission, hosted a regional workshop on youth for peace and security in Accra, Ghana, during the last week of July. This workshop was organized in collaboration with the African Union Youth for Peace program and the West African Network for Peace Building, WANEP, as well as the USAID's Reacting to Early Warning and Response Data Project, the USAID Reward 2 project. And the workshop aimed at building and enhancing capacities of a select group of youth representatives to become trainers and contribute to the attainment of peace and security in West Africa. You had a little comment to make on this one.
All I can say is just getting the youth be aware and make a contribution in achieving peace and security sounds like a very good initiative. I am just impressed.
Yeah, for me, it'll all come down to whether or not we see this youth workshop finding expression in regional policies, as well as the region's response to some of the security challenges that it faces in terms of the regional spread of Boko Haram and other related religious extremist groups that are operating in the region. And that brings us to our last story from the Africa Regional Update, the devastation in Ethiopia's Tigray region. So more than 5.2 million people across Tigray, which accounts to about 90% of the regional population, are now in need of life-saving assistance. The 9-month conflict that erupted in the Tigray region between federal troops and the Tigray People's Liberation Front, TPLF, has spilled over into neighboring Amhara and Afar regions. In Mekelle and Freweni, women who have endured unimaginable violence, including weeks of rape, are unable to receive comprehensive and holistic services they need because most health centers are not functional. And the disruption of essential services, including access to communication, fuel, and the banking system, is compounding this desperate situation. Approximately 100 trucks a day are estimated to be needed in terms of the humanitarian need in the Tigray region, but only 122 trucks have made it into the region since the recent ceasefire was agreed.
This conflict is becoming more regional as days go. It has been reported that Eritrean forces are still lurking around the province of Tigray. And then there's the issue of internally displaced people said to be in the region of about 100,000. It has also been reported, we also reported a few weeks ago that troops from further south in areas like the Oromo and Sidamo region have made their way up to the northeast province of Tigray. So I think in time, the TPLF will respond in kind against this incursion. They might destabilize other southern regions in the same way they have done in the Amhara and the Afar regions. So it's getting dicey, I think.
Very, very, very concerning. And I think on that note, that brings an end to our Africa update this week. That brings us to the numbers game. The number for this week is 4.7%. What do you think that's related to, Sbu? Any guesses this week?
4.7%, that sounds like economic growth in one of the better performing countries, I think. Maybe Zambia or someplace like that.
That's interesting. Sorry to laugh, but I think Zambia is going through its own difficulties at the moment, largely due to public debt, etc. But they're actually going for elections this month. But no, this number is actually about South Africa. Total municipal revenue increased by 4.7% in 2020. The top three largest contributors to total municipal revenue of 421.4 billion were grants and subsidies at 28.8%, electricity sales at 27%, and property rates at 16.8% in 2020. And that brings an end to our episode this week. Africa,